Earth-shaking fire from the world's center will cause tremors around the new city.
Nostradamus is a psychic prophet, and he made predictions about the future as a way to help humanity through the darkness of this world.
Did the Renaissance-era prophet and poet, Nostradamus, actually foresee 9/11 and the other catastrophic events of the last 500 years? Are their prophecies yet to be fulfilled?
He's one of the few prophets that have lasted this long because he's been so right.
Now, on the 500th anniversary of his birth, we take a new look at the real man and his startling predictions of the future. It was 5 centuries ago that a remarkable Frenchman named Michel de Nostradamus left behind what may be one of the most extraordinary records of all time, a voluminous chronicle of hundreds of events that would take place over the next 2,000 years. Today, the lure of his prophecies has grown into a phenomenon all its own.
The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the great new city.
So wrote Nostradamus in 1555. But did he really predict these events and nearly every major disaster of the last half-millennium?
He's a mystery, very enigmatic subject, very enigmatic writer. But the importance to our current situation seems to be that he spent a lot of time focusing on the time period we're in at the moment.
His collected verses offer proof, some say, that he had visions of the future and foresaw such mammoth events as the French Revolution, the space shuttle disasters, and the 2 world wars of the 20th century. But he remains one of history's most controversial figures.
A lot of people have called Nostradamus a prophet. Some people have called him a psychic. Some people have even called him a con artist.
Let's just say that Nostradamus did know any of this stuff. To know it and to not give the information makes him the biggest evil that's ever lived.
Despite the worldwide popularity of his writings, much about the man himself remains a mystery. In 1555, Nostradamus wrote this about himself.
He who is called a prophet now was once called a seer. Strictly speaking, a prophet is one who sees things remote from the natural knowledge of men. Michel Nostradamus.
Was he really a man of extraordinary prophetic vision? Or did he simply cobble together vague cryptic poetry that could easily be applied to almost anything? Was he truly a great healer whose cures were inspired by the stars? Or was he a charlatan who cleverly managed to survive and even prosper in the rigidly Catholic world of 16th century Europe? And are we any closer to understanding the meaning of his coded books of poetry that claim to form a roadmap to the future? Experts are strongly divided over the answers to these questions. What is certain is the promise that Nostradamus made to his readers 500 years ago.
In translation it says, "After 500 years, more heed thou'll take of him who is the adornment of his age. Then light effulgent suddenly shall break, such as that time's great pleasure to engage."
It was a promise that interest in his myriad predictions would be revived on the 500th anniversary of his birth. That year has now arrived.
Nostradamus' 500th birthday is certainly an important anniversary because he himself suggested in one of his quatrains that after 500 years his prophecies would be better appreciated.
Indeed, there are those who believe that Nostradamus foretold such events as the fall of communism, the Gulf War, and the death of Princess Diana, centuries before they actually took place.
A lot of what Nostradamus predicts for this time period that even 10 years ago at the first Persian Gulf War we thought was ridiculous now seems to be coming true every day. You can watch it live on CNN.
Did Nostradamus predict the rise of Nazi Germany? The air battles of World War II? Even the Kennedy assassinations?
The problem with addressing any of the individual things is you're not really addressing the real issue, which is you have to have it before. I mean, I want somebody to come to me and say, I mean, there will be, most likely, another disaster somewhere in the world in the next 5 years. You heard that prediction right here first.
While most prophecies attributed to Nostradamus concern world events and calamities, a few border on the macabre, fueling the belief that he was somehow connected with the dark arts.
Local legend tells us that when Nostradamus' original tomb was looted, the looters discovered around his neck a medallion with the exact date in which his tomb would be opened and pillaged.
Nostradamus is surrounded by myths and old wives' tales and translations by non-translators and interpretations that range from the mildly credulous to the frankly insane. We're not going to get anywhere unless we get back to the real man and what he did and how he did it.
To learn who Nostradamus really was, we must step back to an era that is remarkably well preserved in the sunlit region of southern France known as Provence.
The area in Provence, Avignon to Arles, and then from Nîmes all the way over to Aix, is sort of a melting pot and always has been, going all the way back to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Celts, the Romans, and right on through.
The region was settled 600 years before the birth of Jesus. Its name, Provence, can be traced to its history as the first province of the Roman Empire.
The Romans made it sort of their pleasure garden. Provence is also where Roman emperors would retire or governors of Roman provinces would come to retire. So it had that sort of relaxed, very cosmopolitan, very open feeling from very early on. The Pope spent a lot of time at Avignon during the papal captivity of a few centuries before, and there was still that feeling of this is not exactly the center of the world, but it's one of the centers of the world.
By the 16th century, the world Nostradamus was born into was rapidly changing.
Europe was in a very dangerous state at the time. It was surrounded by enemies. From the east and from the west, the Holy Roman Empire was threatening the country. There was constant war between them. All along the Mediterranean coasts, there were constant raids by Arab pirates, raiding coastal towns and villages. So there was a real atmosphere of threat.
Military attacks, famine, and a fatal disease called the plague characterized life and often death for the common society in 16th century Europe.
You had war, famine, pestilence, death before horsemen of the apocalypse.
During these apocalyptic times, people were desperately searching for answers, cures, and a glimpse of what the future might hold. Into this world came a man who seemed to offer answers, and who some believe traveled into the future. But where did his vision of the future begin? These mystical ruins may hold the answer to the 500-year-old mystery of Nostradamus. You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. It has been nearly half a millennium since Nostradamus recorded his startling predictions of the future, and he has remained a household name through the more than 400 popular books and essays that have been published about his prophecies. His name still appears in newspaper headlines, and his image looks out to us from tabloid pages, movie posters, and book jackets that all promise to give us a glimpse of the real man. But how much of the wizardly impression that we have come to associate with Nostradamus is based on fact? Of the few historical records that exist, there are two artifacts in particular that many believe preserve a realistic image of the man. The first is the portrait of Nostradamus painted by his son, Caesar.
Caesar was quite a good painter. What the portrait shows us is a man with a very broad, smiling face, ready to crack a joke. The image in the portrait seems to inspire quite a bit of confidence. It's almost like he's your favorite grandfather come to comfort you. But there's a twinkle in his eye. He seems to say, oh, I can be quite funny, oh, I can be serious and intense.
Experts believe the second true description of Nostradamus was written by one of his closest confidants.
This is the description of Nostradamus by his secretary, Chavigny. He was of somewhat less than average height, physically robust, lively and vigorous. He had a broad, open brow, a straight, even nose, and grey eyes, whose gaze was gentle but which blazed when he was angry. His cheeks were crimson, even in extreme old age. His beard was long and thick. His countenance was both severe and smiling, so that his severity was seen to be tempered with great humanity. For the rest, he was alert, subject to sudden instant rages, yet a patient worker. He slept only 4 or 5 hours a night.
The era in which Nostradamus lived was a time of transition. As the fear and uncertainty of the Middle Ages was coming to an end, a new era was beginning. With the dawn of the Renaissance, the entire view of the universe was starting to change. Nowhere was this more apparent than inside the walls of Saint-Rémy, the French provincial town where Nostradamus was born.
Saint-Rémy retains its medieval flavor, including a sewer in the middle of the street. It looks much the same as it would have in Nostradamus' time.
Author and guide Vincent Bridges has traced Nostradamus' legacy from its earliest beginnings in Saint-Rémy to this street address, number 6, Rue Hoch.
Nostradamus was born in this house in 1503. In all probability, it was his grandmother's dwelling.
The mother acted as the midwife, basically. And the latest research is that, in fact, the house where he grew up was a rather ampler property next door.
He was baptized Michel de Notre Dame, a Catholic name that means Our Lady. It was adopted by Nostradamus' Jewish grandfather when he converted to Catholicism during the Spanish Inquisition, a time when Jews in Europe were persecuted. In spite of the religious repression of the time, the south of France was cosmopolitan and alive with myth, magic, and the excitement of advances in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy.
More than the perfect place, it's probably the only place in Europe that someone like Nostradamus could have been trained, taught, and allowed to reach his fulfillment.
Young Michel de Notre Dame was intrigued by such studies at a very early age.
His paternal grandfather, Jean de Saint-Rémy, was the town councillor and perhaps physician. So there was a tradition of learning in the family. So Nostradamus would very early on have learned Latin, probably a little Hebrew, and mathematics.
In addition to the rudiments of mathematics, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, his grandfather introduced him to the celestial sciences. And it is from his grandfather that he probably inherited his astrolabe, the medieval instrument that was once used to determine the altitude of the sun and other celestial bodies. Nostradamus would later write of the astronomical wonders that inspired his interest in astrology.
Jupiter being more joined to Venus than to the moon, appearing in white fullness, Venus hidden under the whiteness of Neptune, struck by Mars through the Milky Way.
While some believe this poem suggests Nostradamus had predicted the orbits of the planets, he most likely got the idea in 1543, when the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus published his theory of the solar system in a book called Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. But if his early interest in astronomy was inspired by his grandfather, his surroundings kindled his passion for antiquity.
Provence is multi-layered with history, and Saint-Remy is one of those places where history is just stacked up, one ruin on top of another ruin.
For the young Nostradamus, the most vivid and direct connection with another time lay not in the supernatural, but just a few hundred yards south of his home in Saint-Remy.
Nostradamus played here as a child. It was his first introduction to the ancient history of the region. In 6 quatrains, he predicted that a great mystery or a buried treasure would be found in this region.
Unto the ancient vestal edifices, the mausoleum in the cavern of goats, the booty will be taken from between 2 rocks.
At the foot of Les Alpilles, a balding range of limestone mountains, stood the entrance to an ancient Roman city called Glanum, complete with a mausoleum and triumphal arch. The treasure or booty Nostradamus predicted may have been a large portion of the city that was not to be discovered and excavated until 1921. Had he seen the future? We may never know the answer, but certainly this place inspired young Nostradamus.
Just to play in the shadow of these monuments was to bathe in the overpowering aura of another time.
Sculpted into the mausoleum were downcast prisoners and scenes of battle from an ancient Roman conquest.
What's all this, these huge monuments? Must have been a race of giants. They were absolutely dumbstruck by the whole thing.
Inside the Roman triumphal arch, Nostradamus probably marveled at its acoustic properties that echoed and amplified the sounds made inside it.
He could walk to the ruins, and as his education developed, he could read the Latin inscriptions, appreciate the arch, appreciate the art on the mausoleum. And what it seems to have done is it gave him a sense for history itself, that we weren't necessarily living in a very small, narrow, human time frame, but that there were centuries in which things happened, very important things, that were lost.
Another source of wonder for the young Nostradamus still stands in the nearby quarry that was used to build the ancient Roman city. Scholars believe it inspired one of his most cryptic passages.
This is the pyramid that Nostradamus refers to in Century 4, Quatrain 27.
Salon, morsel of the Arch of Sextus, where the pyramid is still standing. They will come to deliver the Prince of Anamark.
No one has ever deciphered this prophecy. Experts believe it may refer to a kidnapped prince being returned, but from where and when remains a mystery. What is clear is that this ancient site marked a beginning.
This inspired Nostradamus. We can sort of speculate that it inspired him to look at the broader view of history, to think not just in terms of one man's life or one particular lifetime, but to think in terms of hundreds and thousands of years.
The renowned 16th century poet and scholar Pierre de Ronsard wrote of Nostradamus,
"Perhaps it is the immense eternity of the great God that has aroused the fervor of Nostradamus. Or perhaps a good or bad demon kindles it. Or perhaps his spirit is moved by nature and climbs to the heavens beyond mortals, and from there repeats to us prodigious facts. I would not have believed him, had not heaven, which assigns good and evil to mankind, been his inspiration."
When we return, Nostradamus, not just a prophet, but a doctor ahead of his time? You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. It was a time of wonder. As young Nostradamus was growing up, the world around him offered a breathtaking pageant of man's greatest achievements. Christopher Columbus had crossed the Atlantic on his fourth and final voyage to the New World. In Florence, Italy, sculptor Michelangelo Buonarroti had chiseled a 17-foot marble masterpiece called David. And Leonardo da Vinci had painted a portrait called the Mona Lisa. In 1519, 16-year-old Michel de Notre-Dame was packed off to the ancient walled city of Avignon, along the banks of the Rhone River in southern France. Here he was enrolled in a curriculum of rhetoric, mathematics, music, and astronomy. Popular belief holds that he became a great young scholar and even a doctor while at the University of Avignon. But the plague's advance through this region at the time made a long stay at the university unlikely.
In 1520, when Nostradamus was 17, the Rhone overflowed its banks, washing sewage through the streets and flooding bodies out of the cemetery. Soon thereafter, a virulent plague broke out here in Avignon.
He spent about a year there before he had to leave because of the plague, so he wouldn't have completed the course. So the basic things like rhetoric and so on and so forth, he would have gone into, but he probably didn't get as far as the astrology or the music or the geometry or the arithmetic, which are in the second part of the curriculum.
But the virulent strain of the Black Plague that closed the bridge of Avignon to all but the bravest souls and postponed Nostradamus' formal studies offered its own form of instruction.
Perhaps this event helped Nostradamus understand the importance of fresh water in sanitation to a town. Later, as a doctor, he would insist on fresh water and clean streets as a way to prevent the plague.
Records indicate that Nostradamus left Avignon in 1521 to wander the French countryside in search of herbs and remedies. While a modern French pharmacy offers a ready source of medicines today, in Nostradamus' time, the pharmacy looked like this. To honor Nostradamus' 500th birthday, the southern French town of Égalier has planted an alchemical herb garden of the type Nostradamus would have used as he experimented with herbal medicine. Madame de la Rosière is curator.
In the garden, you can find plants that protect against thunderstorms, plants that keep witches at bay, plants that enable girls to find out the name of their promised love before meeting him.
The significance of an alchemical garden such as this one to Nostradamus would have been its meaning and symbolism. He would have understood the symbols in this garden. He used them in his work, and other alchemists used them as well.
The medicinal plants Nostradamus would have encountered on his wanderings include artichokes, whose roots were believed to be a cure for jaundice; elder tree, whose branches were used to treat fever; grenade fruit, thought to increase strength; and a variety of flowering plants, roses, lavender, and sage, whose uses were not yet fully understood. After 8 years of collecting herbs, Nostradamus reported,
Having spent my youthful years in the knowledge and understanding of medicinal herbs, I moved through a number of lands and countries from 1521 to 1529, constantly in search of medicinal knowledge.
It was now as a 26-year-old apothecary that Nostradamus enrolled in medical school at the prestigious Montpellier University. But his handwritten application implies that he may not have been that serious about his studies.
He signed the passage, Mihi de Nostra Domina, a little bit of casualness.
Most people believe it was here that the self-named Mihi de Nostra Domina graduated from the rank of pharmacist to doctor. But that has now come into question. Although Nostradamus called himself Doctor of Medicine in his later books, there is no record of him ever graduating from the Montpellier Medical School. In fact, a newly translated document from the university archives proclaims that Nostradamus' name was scratched off the school register. The reason cited is that as a headstrong apothecary, he made rude comments about the doctors.
If you'd asked me a few years ago who Nostradamus was, I would probably have said that he was a doctor, an astrologer, and a prophet. Now, we know he went to the Montpellier medical faculty and was admitted. We also know that he was kicked out again.
In spite of this setback, he was determined to become a doctor. And so, Michel de Notre Dame Latinized his name to Nostradamus and set out in the great tradition of Hippocrates. The Greek father of medicine had once instructed that a doctor must be a traveler. For Nostradamus, that meant following the plague.
Nostradamus became very well known as a plague doctor. Whether or not he was a doctor, it didn't matter, but certainly when all the local doctors fled, he was one of those who tended to go in and try to treat the plague.
As Nostradamus' son Caesar would later write, the task was daunting.
Persons stricken by the furor of this malady completely abandon all hope of recovery. The houses are abandoned and empty, men disfigured, women in tears. The stretcher bearers work on credit.
Nostradamus himself made this chilling observation upon entering a plague-stricken city.
Among the most admirable things I saw was a woman who was sewing herself unaided into her own shroud, starting at the feet. Inside, she was found dead in the middle of her house, with her sewing half finished.
In the medical practice of the 16th century, knowledge of the stars came first. Doctors used astrology and the birth date of the patient to diagnose the sickness. What followed were crude treatments. Thousands died not only from disease, but from the practice of bloodletting and planting leeches on the skin, procedures thought to release evil from the body.
Nostradamus was not an unorthodox medical practitioner. He bled people when he thought it was necessary, applied leeches, and so forth. A lot of our contemporary authors have seen him as the great 16th century medical man with all this modern insight, and this wasn't the case. His dictum was use what worked, and he reports in one of his books that bleeding did no good at all. So we can say that, okay, he did bleed, but it didn't work as well as he would have liked.
Nostradamus drew on his experience with herbs to concoct new remedies. The best known were his rose lozenges, a formula he penned in 1555.
300 to 400 red roses plucked before dawn are pulverized and mixed with sawdust from the greenest cypress, iris of Florence, cloves, and odorated calamus root.
Now, calamus root is a powerful antioxidant. It's also an immune booster. It aids in healing and so forth. And that was one of the major ingredients. So apparently what the rose pills did is it had a little bit of camphor, and the rose hips would give you a little vitamin C. The camphor would be a disinfectant.
Little more is known of this remedy, but some hold that his best weapon against disease was a belief in cleanliness.
What he did was he burned bodies, burned bedding, burned everything that the people, that anyone who had contracted the plague had come in contact with. And he recommended airing the houses out, free-flowing water, and so forth, cleaning the streets, washing the streets down, and so forth. What this would have done, it would have driven the rats out, killed a lot of the rats, and killed a lot of the fleas that caused the plague. He was able to bring it down to, a month, 2 months duration of the plague, which was quite miraculous for that time period.
In the town of Aachen, where his reputation as a healer had been affirmed, Nostradamus met and married a woman named Henrietta d'Ancos in 1531. They had 2 children. Local history holds that during their years together, Henrietta reawakened her husband's interest in the mystical arts. He shared with her the ancient books he had once studied as a child, even dabbling in ritual magic. But if Nostradamus was indeed a prophet at that time, he knew that this happiness would soon come to a tragic end. You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. The Nostradamus of lore and legend conjures up images of a mysterious wizard consorting with spirits, demons, and angels. But looking back through the veils of time, a different image emerges, that of a normal man from an average, even somewhat prominent family.
This farmhouse belonged to Nostradamus' younger brother, Bertrand. In its time, it was a splendid country home, and it shows us that Bertrand was not only a wealthy landowner and merchant, and he was also captain of the local militia.
The family's wealth no doubt contributed to Nostradamus' ability to travel as he pleased. In 1533, he was again on a journey through Europe and southern France. He referred to these wanderings as periods of study and learning. One such journey brought him to the home of Julius Caesar Scaliger, an Italian scientist, mathematician, and, most important to Nostradamus, a renowned doctor and graduate of Montpellier Medical School, the same one from which he had been expelled. Researchers speculate that Nostradamus probably supplied Dr. Scaliger with herbal medicines, and that in exchange, Scaliger mentored Nostradamus in human anatomy, physiology, even dissection. These studies would have been conducted in secret because the church believed such work to be a crime against God. Nostradamus would later write a glowing testimonial to the Renaissance figure, praising him as his most influential teacher.
Scaliger seems to have inherited Cicero's ability in eloquence, Virgil's in poetry, and Galen's twice over in medicine. I owe him more than anyone else in the world.
The other major influence in Nostradamus' life was a family tragedy. In 1534, while he was away from home, Nostradamus' wife and 2 children fell victim to the plague and died. At this point in his life, Nostradamus was known only as a healer and an intellectual. But the death of his wife and children set him on the path of mysticism. Magic and the occult drove his life from this point forward.
At the age of 47, Nostradamus got married for the second time after having lost his first wife and 2 children.
His second marriage was to Anne Ponsard, the widow of an affluent lawyer. Anne brought considerable wealth to their marriage and ultimately bore him 6 children. They settled in the southern French village of Salon-de-Provence. The town is now a fashionable tourist destination, but the presence of the 500-year-old seer can still be felt. A giant likeness of Nostradamus has recently been added to watch over visitors. The ancient clock tower, a monument to knowledge, still displays an image of the 7 known planets of the 16th century. And the cobbled street where he made his home now pays homage to its most famous resident.
This is the street where Nostradamus lived, and this is the house where Nostradamus lived for the last 20 years of his life and where he wrote the prophecies.
His home and salon was substantial for the time, and it would have been a little cramped with 6 children, servants, and secretaries and so forth. About appropriate for a doctor who's making a good living, good income for the time.
In 1550, Nostradamus began to write almanacs that included practical information for farmers in the year ahead.
Nostradamus's almanacs were very similar to Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard Almanac. They predicted the weather. They gave you information about crops and food, suggestions as to how to live, what to eat. There might be quotes from other famous people of the time. There was certainly astrology, and he published this to help bring in money to support his large family.
The almanacs also contained vague prophecies of the future, predictions that came true, if you believed them.
At this new moon shall be born many monsters as much human as animal. Floods, droughts, bishops born, and princes die.
King Henry II read them almost daily. Nostradamus was one of the first people actually to earn his living by writing annual almanacs.
With the success of this publishing venture, Nostradamus reached out to a wider audience with his treatise on cosmetics and confections.
In the 16th century, the idea that to be noble, to be a gentlewoman, required a certain look, and that the newly established middle class could partake of that, this was a very powerful idea. Every well-to-do woman who wanted whiter teeth and clearer skin and a good remedy to get red hair picked up a copy. And Nostradamus really cashed in on this. It was really the 16th century equivalent of a bestseller.
The handbook included recipes for hair dyes, perfumes, cough medicine, and a sort of Renaissance-strength toothpaste.
To whiten the teeth, no matter how black and brown they may be, grind 3 drams each of crystal, flint, white marble, glass, rock salt, and snail shells. Rub the teeth with this powder, and in a few days you will see the teeth get whiter.
While Europeans sought vanity in his beauty products, Nostradamus began seeking the future.
Nostradamus made a workroom, or even perhaps added a story to the top of his house. Bear in mind that he had 6 kids and that he needed quiet to do this work. So he needed somewhere away from them, and he needed a time away from them. So what he seems to have done was to do most of his work up in his study in the top story of the house at night when all the kids were asleep.
Nostradamus left a record of the nightly ritual that unfolded as he gazed into a bowl of water placed on his desk, a practice reminiscent of the Oracle of Delphi.
Sitting alone at night in secret study, a slight flame comes out of the emptiness and makes successful that which should not be believed in vain.
There's a whole school of thought that Nostradamus was what was called at the time a theurgist. Theurgist is a medieval word for magician. A theurgist is a person who, by means of talking to angels and so forth, had direct communication with God.
The wand in the hand is placed in the middle. With water he sprinkles both the hem of his garment and his foot. A voice, fear. He trembles in his robes. Divine splendor. The god sits nearby.
I'm not sure what Nostradamus himself used to get into the state that allowed him to make his prophecies, but certainly other seers, prophets, shamans have quite set rituals and practices that they do use, and these seem to be, to a certain extent, universal. Fasting is certainly one. Meditation or contemplation is another.
It is through these kinds of rituals, many believe, that Nostradamus recorded the prophecies of events to take place through the year 3797. Among them, a terrifying foretelling of the end of the world. You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. The night. It was as important a tool to Nostradamus as his ancient books, his quill pen, and the astrolabe that had been handed down to him by his grandfather. Time and again, Nostradamus kept long vigils into the night, practicing a ritual called scrying. He would gaze into a mirror, a bowl of water or a crystal ball and try to see visions of the future. But experts believe there was more to his technique.
According to a passage in the preface to the prophecies, he tells us that the true secret of his method was something that he was going to take with him to his grave. He combined alchemy with astrology and with Kabbalistic magic and Christian mysticism as his method to see into the future.
Some say that his secret method was the study of celestial events.
From his study, he could get out onto the roof of a sort of turret on the corner of his house, where he could be next to the stars.
What he used were astronomical and astrological conjunctions and alignments. So he might say an event would happen when Saturn and Jupiter were in Pisces. The problem with that is that these conjunctions reoccur. So you might have a choice of quite a number of dates that such an event could possibly happen.
Nostradamus recorded his predictions in 1,000 four-line poems called quatrains. He wrote in his native French, but to protect himself from the witch hunters of the day, he obscured the verse with Latin and Greek, even anagrams. He divided his writings into 10 groups of 100 quatrains each, which he called centuries. And as he completed his first set, Nostradamus destroyed any evidence that the Inquisition might label as criminal.
I have at my disposal volumes which have long been hidden, but dreading what use might be made of them, I consigned them to the flames.
Nostradamus kept his sources secret, it would seem, but then that would be obvious. If he's claiming to write a book of prophecies, he doesn't want necessarily everybody to know where he got them from. If he had any magical sources, he allegedly burnt those. He didn't want the idea to get out that he was some sort of magician. The local people were pretty suspicious of him as it was.
Europe at large got its first glimpse of Nostradamus's quatrains in May 1555, when the collection called Les Prophéties de Michel de Notre Dame was published.
The most famous was the quatrain about King Henri II as to how he would die, which was in a joust where a lance pierced his golden helmet.
The young lion will overcome the old one in single combat. In a cage of gold, his eyes will be put out, 2 wounds in one, then to die a cruel death.
The young lion, through the pierced visor into his brain. All of these are clues that are in the quatrain that point directly to a very specific event.
As obscure as these verses sound to many of us, they were very clear in 16th century France. Nostradamus's 35th quatrain of the 1st century was immediately seized upon as suggesting that the reigning king of France, Henry II, would die in a jousting tournament.
The Queen, Catherine de' Medici, tried to stop the king from dueling because of Nostradamus's quatrain that predicted his tragic end. Thus, this prediction is the most important one since it began his career as a world-renowned prophet.
The fatal accident occurred in the summer of 1559 as the king celebrated his daughter's wedding with a joust. He rode against Count Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard.
They had 3 tilts, and on the 3rd tilt, the Comte de Montgomery's lance shattered, and one of the shards went through the visor of Henri II's helmet and either pierced his eye or his left temple. And he lingered for 11 days in excruciating pain and then died.
That night, Count Montgomery said of Nostradamus,
"Cursed be the Divine One, who predicted it so evilly and so well."
Before 1559, Nostradamus had been a local legend and a curiosity.
But he really wasn't an international superstar until after Henri II's death. Then suddenly, it was as if, oh, this is more than just someone writing some obscure verses. There's meaning here. So within a year or so of Henri II's death, the Prophéties, first volume of the Prophéties, was being translated in London, and he was an international 16th century superstar.
After the death of Henry II, Queen Catherine de' Medici and her court toured France in an effort to reassure an uneasy nation. The historic procession, carried by no less than 7,000 royal horses, marched into Salon de Provence in 1564. When they arrived at their southern castle, the Chateau Lempereur in Salon, the Queen sent for Nostradamus. She later reported,
"As we were passing through Salon, we have seen Nostradamus, who has promised to my son, King Charles IX, long life."
Nostradamus was summoned to court for an interview with Catherine de' Medici, who was the queen at the time. And because he had accurately predicted what had happened to the late king, she asked him to tell her the fates of her 7 children, who were small. They were fairly small at the time.
The meeting was held in the Salle d'Honneur, otherwise known as the fireplace room. Nostradamus examined each of the 7 royal children and cast their horoscopes for the future.
And he correctly told her that every one of her children would become kings and queens. They'd be crowned heads of different countries throughout Europe.
History proved his prediction to be correct. But the reason for the siblings' swift royal ascension was that 4 of them would suffer untimely deaths. In the edition of his prophecies published in 1557, Nostradamus wrote of the royal family,
"The 7 branches will be reduced to 3. The older ones will be surprised by death."
If the 7 branches were indeed the 7 children of Catherine de' Medici, then Nostradamus had correctly predicted the future. Only 3, Henry III, Francois, and Marguerite, were still alive by 1576. Nostradamus may also have foreseen the American Revolution. In several quatrains, he is said to have written about the British colonists striking out on their own in a war for independence.
"The West shall be free from the British Isles. The elder sister of the British Isles will be born 15 years before her brother. She will succeed to the kingdom of balance."
Since that time, Nostradamus's centuries have been credited with predicting a pantheon of world-shaping events and people. The most startling involved powerful and tyrannical leaders, like Napoleon Bonaparte.
Many of his quatrains were about Napoleon. He talks about Napoleon being born on an island in Italy and then also being exiled to an island. He was not fond of Napoleon. I think he referred to him as a butcher.
An emperor will be born near Italy. He will cost his empire very dearly. He will be found less a prince than a butcher. From a simple soldier, he will attain the empire. From a short robe, he will attain the long.
Born in Corsica, Napoleon did, in fact, begin in the short robe of a soldier, and later take on the long robes of an emperor.
For 14 years, he will hold the tyranny.
Indeed, Napoleon's reign of war and terror began in November 1799 and lasted 14 years, until he was exiled on Elba in April 1814. Another quatrain may have been written as an anagram to predict Napoleon's bloody wars.
Pau, Ney, Laurent will be more than fire and blood.
If you're prepared to use anagrams, then because Nostradamus on one occasion talks about 3 places called Ney, Pau, and Laurent, you can anagrammatize that to say Napoleon Roi, Napoleon the King.
Perhaps because he was French, many of Nostradamus's writings focused upon his native country. Some believe he predicted the French Revolution of 1789, 234 years before it happened. His quatrains describe the lurid details of the executions by guillotine of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI.
Revolt destroys the old order and lifts its head to heaven. The mouth will swim in its own blood. Elected French king causes tempest, fire, blood, slice.
Predictions like these have fascinated and baffled the world as one after another have appeared to come true, even through the 20th century. But are the greatest catastrophes yet to come? You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. There is a rich history in interpreting and manipulating Nostradamus's writings. Over the centuries, certain words and phrases in his works have led many to believe he predicted dozens of history's most significant milestones.
Although I have often foretold long before what hath afterward come to pass, I was willing to hold my peace. But afterwards, I wrote in dark and cryptic sentences, clouding my writing in obscure, but above all, prophetic language. The events of the future evolution of humankind, especially the most urgent ones.
In 1555, Nostradamus wrote,
Pasteur will be honored as a demigod. This happens when the moon completes her great cycle.
This quatrain may foretell the work of pioneer scientist Louis Pasteur, creator of the food-preserving process that bears his name. Or it may simply be a verse that includes the French word for church pastor, which is also pasteur.
We're now in the approach phase, everything looking good.
He will be taken to the corner of Luna, where he will be placed on a foreign land.
Some believe that this passage offers definitive proof that Nostradamus predicted the future of space travel.
The landing on the moon was one of the most amazing predictions Nostradamus ever made, and here's the reason why. He states that he will come to travel to the corner of Luna, where he will be placed on a strange and alien land. And if you look at the word Luna, that's an obvious reference to the moon, Luna being Latin for the moon. And that event occurred in 1969. That's one of the most clearly stated prophecies that Nostradamus ever made.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Some Nostradamians hold that quatrain number 146 even foretells the appearance of UFOs, describing an extraterrestrial sighting and landing that brings great benefits to humanity, as well as an earthquake.
A great fire shall fall from the sky for 3 nights. A thing shall happen stupendous and wonderful, and shortly after the ground shall quake.
Experts agree that the most serious examination of Nostradamus' writings centers on a series of controversial quatrains that seem to foretell one of the world's most horrific events: the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Beasts wild with hunger will cross rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. The Great One will be dragged in an iron cage when the child of Germany observes nothing.
When it comes to Hitler, he had quite a bit to say about Hitler and Germany. He never uses the name Hitler. Instead, he uses the ancient term for the Danube, which is the Hister or the Ister.
German High Command has committed at least 20 full-strength divisions to the winter offensive.
In quatrain 224, Nostradamus wrote, the greater part of the army will be against Hister. And if you look at history and see all the number of nations who oppose the Axis powers, you can see that Hitler was indeed opposed by the greater army of the world, and the greater army of the world conquered the Nazis.
But why would Nostradamus use the term Hister to refer to the German dictator?
Nostradamus used illusions to symbolically represent people and things. And one of the words that he used was Hister. And in my mind, it's rather clear that Hister is an allusion to Adolf Hitler. It's only one letter off from the name Hitler.
We're talking about an anagram of Hitler with a double meaning, which is something that he liked to do.
Many believe that the use of the phrase iron cage was another symbol used by Nostradamus to represent the iron machinery of war.
A captain of Greater Germany will seduce a great troop by his oratory. The warlike party will subjugate the borders of the Danube to pursue the cross through the crooked cross of iron.
In Quatrain 335, Nostradamus stated that someone would seduce a great troop by his speech. Okay, and if we look at that from a historical viewpoint, we see that Adolf Hitler was a great orator. And he was well known as a silver-tongued devil, so to speak. And he indeed seduced a great troop of people with his speech.
The Nazis seized upon the flexible meanings of Nostradamus's quatrains for their own benefit, and Hitler capitalized on the familiar name of Nostradamus by quoting prophecies like this in his propaganda.
He will transfer into Greater Germany, Brabant, Gand, Bruges, and Boulogne. The truce a sham. The great Duke will attack Vienna and Cologne.
Bear in mind that Magda Goebbels, the wife of Hitler's propaganda minister, thought that Nostradamus prophesied the triumph of the Nazis, and that generally permeated the party.
But if Nostradamus predicted a triumph for Hitler, he also spelled out the great suffering of his victims.
After the victory of the raving tongue, the bloody emperor by battle makes speeches throughout the conflict, roasting the tongue and the flesh and the bones.
Quatrain number 456 appears to be a direct reference to the Holocaust. Nostradamus wrote, during the battle, the bloody victor makes speeches, roasting the tongue, flesh, and bones. And to me, that's a very, very candid observation of the horrible tragedy of the Holocaust, because a lot of people were burned to death.
Suffering, tyrants, and even conquest. Some believe that Nostradamus predicted one of the greatest military battles in history. June 6, 1944, more than 5,000 ships and aircraft landed 22,000 Allied troops on the shores of Normandy in France. Did Nostradamus allude to the epic World War II assault known as D-Day?
Through the German people and neighboring places, they will be at war over the clouds. A swarm of marine locusts and gnats, the faults of Geneva will be laid quite bare.
It's fascinating how he's trying to describe these battle scenes in words that he knows, because he has never seen these events before. He doesn't use the word D-Day, and he doesn't use troops either. He uses other words like the marine locusts and strange and terrible ships coming onto the shore.
Nostradamus's obscure verses have also been credited with predicting the atomic blasts in Japan that ended World War II.
Near the ports and within 2 cities, there will happen 2 scourges, the like of which was never seen. Hunger, plague, people thrown out by steel, crying for help.
It appears to reference the nuclear attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the line reads, within 2 cities, there will be 2 scourges, the likes of which have never been seen before. And if you look at the pictures of the destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you will see that there's twisted metal everywhere. And to me, that very strongly suggests or describes a nuclear blast, which had never occurred before in history until the year 1945.
In addition to the destruction wrought by the Second World War, Nostradamus may have also foretold the great social changes that would sweep through Eastern Europe half a century later.
The communal law will be made in opposition. The old order will hold strong, then are removed from the scene. Then communism put far behind. The wall of the East will fall, thunder and lightning.
He predicted the fall of communism. A number of quatrains do talk about Russia. He talks about the Berlin Wall. He doesn't use the word Berlin.
As numerous as Nostradamus' prophecies are, they were written in a comparatively brief span of time. His collected quatrains were completed in just over 2 years. But in that time, his vision stretched all the way to the year 3797. Could that year mark the end of the world? You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. Many believe that Nostradamus predicted the epic warfare and unimaginable destruction that would take place hundreds of years after his lifetime. But if his prophecies are real, he wrote of people he could never have imagined, in places that didn't yet exist. Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963.
The ancient work shall be accomplished from the roof. Evil lightning shall fall on the great man. Being dead, they will accuse an innocent man of the deed, the guilty one hidden in the misty copse.
In quatrain number 637, Nostradamus appears to make a reference to the Kennedy assassination. And there's 2 lines that really stick out in my mind. The first one is, being dead, they will accuse an innocent one of the deed. If you stop and think about it, Lee Harvey Oswald was the self-admitted patsy of that crime. In my opinion, he was the one who was falsely accused.
The quatrain continues with a reference to the guilty one, hidden in the misty copse.
And if you look up the definition of the word copse, you'll see that it describes a small thicket of trees and shrubs. And being one who lives in Dallas, I can tell you that that's an exact description of the infamous grassy knoll.
Another quatrain, written in 1556, apparently foretells of the misfortune that would befall another U.S. president, Richard Nixon.
The old man shall be baffled and deprived of his place by the stranger that shall have instigated him.
This vague passage may predict the disgrace of yet another U.S. president.
Honor to be blinded by lust. The offense of the adulterer will become known, which will occur to his great dishonor.
Believers say this quatrain refers to the White House scandal involving Monica Lewinsky and then-President Bill Clinton.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
Quatrain number 228 allegedly predicts tragedy for another renowned figure, Princess Diana, who died in Paris on August 31st, 1997.
The penultimate of the surname of the prophet will take Diana for his day and rest.
The first line has been said to refer to Dodi al-Fayed, the son of Harrod's owner, Muhammad al-Fayed, whose name resembles that of an Islamic prophet. The second line, his day and rest, may refer to Sunday, the traditional Sabbath and the day of the week that she died. The words day of rest may also refer to the public holiday on the day of Diana's funeral. All shops and businesses were closed in England as the world shared an outpouring of grief for one of the most popular women of the century. It may be hard to imagine that the prophecies of Nostradamus were actually written in the 16th century, an age so radically different from our own. Yet, much like his contemporary Leonardo da Vinci, Nostradamus seemed to describe technologies which no one of his time had ever seen.
Earthly and watery fish is thrown upon the shore by a great wave, its strange form wild and horrifying. From the sea to the walls, they instantly reach the enemy.
Nostradamus definitely predicted airplanes, submarines, and a great deal of modern technology.
At night, they will think they have seen the sun. They will see the pig-like half-man. Noise, shouts, battles seen in the heavens.
Is this fighter pilot the pig-like half-man of Nostradamus's vision?
we can see that even though he saw these things, he didn't quite understand them, and he saw them very much as modern marvels. Airplanes in particular seem to have been a double-edged sword. He could see that they would have benefit, but he could also see that they would be a great instrument of war.
Some Nostradamus believe that his writings describe the First Gulf War with its massive troop movements, stealth technologies, and burning oil fields.
Very nearly 1 million men toward Persia. The true serpent will invade Byzantium and Egypt. He will enter wicked, infamous villain, tyrannizing over Mesopotamia, the land horrible and black in appearance.
Nostradamus uses ancient terms for certain areas of the world. Libya, Persia, the Middle East generally, Islam, Mohammedanism. He talks about men with turbans.
Many experts suggest that there is another quatrain even more specific to the recent war waged against Saddam Hussein.
He will be unable to protect himself by sea. Between two rivers, he will fear the military hand. The black one, irate, will make him regret it.
Quatrain number 633 appears to be a reference to combat and military activity in Iraq. And the two lines that really hit me hard are the lines, between two rivers, he will fear the military hand. The black one, irate, will make him regret it. So it appears to me that this is a reference to combat in and around Iraq, because Baghdad is located in between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which are two of the oldest rivers in history. The black one, making him regret it, might be a reference to Colin Powell making Saddam Hussein regret his actions.
One thing is certain. Nostradamus seldom wrote about peaceful times. The majority of his quatrains deal with destruction and loss. One of his designations for impending disaster has come to be recognized as the comet.
After a great misery for mankind, an even greater approaches. The great motor of the centuries is renewed. It will rain blood, milk, famine, iron, and pestilence. In the sky will be seen a fire, dragging a trail of sparks.
If you look at the comet and the trailing clouds of sparks quatrain, then you begin to see that that idea of a comet and the shuttle disaster sort of overlapped each other, that they became part of the same metaphor, part of the same image.
But the comet of Nostradamus's quatrains may signify more than looming tragedy.
He does talk about comets, but usually as presages to an event, not that we're necessarily going to be struck by a comet.
In fact, some believe it may be Nostradamus's indication of a series of events that are unfolding right now.
When the comet shall come, Mabus shall come, and soon after shall die. Of people and beasts shall be a horrible destruction. Then on sudden vengeance shall be seen blood, hand, thirst, famine.
When we start looking at some of these quatrains that apparently relate to our time period, we have to look for anagrams, we have to look for events, we have to look for interpretations that maybe are not apparent on the surface.
Quatrain number 262 names an evil leader or leaders by a strange name, Mabus.
Mabus is an anagram that is apparently made up of Osama bin Laden and George Bush, components that go together to make Mabus. So apparently, Nostradamus is pointing us to a time period in which, from his point of view, it was very hard to tell the good guys from the bad guys. Just there was a lot of strange stuff going on and things blew up.
Are the tragic events described by Nostradamus in his Mabus quatrain already happening?
At 45 degrees, the sky will burn. Fire approaches the new city. Instantly, a huge, scattered flame leaps up when they demand proof of the Normans.
Regarding the events of 9/11, there are several key words contained in 6 or 7 quatrains that really seem to reference that tragedy. One is a reference to a huge fireball that leaps up into the sky.
Experts also point out the line that contains the new city.
The new city being a reference to New York City. And if you think about the line, the great new city, and you put a blank between new and city, you can easily put York in there, and you can realize that the new city was the illusion that Nostradamus used for New York City.
The most sobering line of the quatrain seems to predict the exact location.
At 45 degrees, the sky will burn is a reference to the events of 9/11 because the 45th degree of latitude travels across the northern edge of New York State.
Nostradamus seems to have written these verses about a country that was not yet born, some 3,000 miles away. But some experts are skeptical.
What I'd like the Nostradamus to do is tell us about the next World Trade Center disaster before it happens, not after. It's not fair to go and see what happened and take the headlines and go, aha!
In fact, many are convinced that Nostradamus possessed no special powers whatsoever and was, in fact, nothing more than a charlatan.
Just another one of the crank nonsense things that weak people believe in. There's not even any mystery about Nostradamus.
You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. For nearly 500 years, the 16th century seer Nostradamus has been touted as one of the most important prophets in history. But he has also had his naysayers.
There's not even any mystery about Nostradamus. That's the interesting thing. I mean, we pretty much know that everything he predicts after the fact. You look back at something he's written that's nonsense, and then after it's happened, you're able to say, oh, that's what he meant.
Vagueness was part of Nostradamus' stock in trade. His prophecies needed to be catch-alls so that a whole range of events could be seen to apply to them, so that they would cover almost anything that might happen in that general area.
Some skeptics believe this vague language was a device used by Nostradamus to launch attacks upon the leaders of his day, without risking his own life.
When he said, you know, the three-headed beast or whatever, he could always then have an out say, no, I wasn't talking about our king, come on. Just talking about the future or something like that. In my opinion, Nostradamus was neither a psychic nor a con artist. I think he was a social commentator, much like opinion editorial writers today. He was writing at a time, however, when the idea of free speech and commentary that was critical of the political system or the king and so forth of the day was not allowed.
Why then do so many people continue to believe that Nostradamus was writing about the future and predicted such dire events as Hiroshima and the explosion of the 2 space shuttle missions?
People always want something to believe. I mean, they're always looking for the greater order to the world, and the idea that somebody 500 years ago might have seen our entire world makes it, I think, gives some people a sense of security that if they read his readings, then they know it's going to happen too.
Skeptics, however, are critical of Nostradamus's collected prophecies.
Where are the Nostradamus people in 1925, talking about the stock market crash? Where are the Nostradamus people in September 1963, talking about JFK in Dallas? Where are they before the fact? I mean, that is the easiest test you could possibly do on Nostradamus.
Nostradamus's first and most famous prediction was that the French king, Henry II, would die in a joust.
The young lion will overcome the old one in single combat.
But close inspection of this quatrain reveals little to connect it to a specific event.
It talks about the young lion overcoming the old lion. Well, Montgomery and Henry II were very close of age. It was not a young and old. And it wasn't on a field of battle. In fact, it was a game, a duel, on a gaming field. And in any case, it was an accident. They were just dueling. You weren't supposed to draw blood. It was a game. Try to knock the other guy off. The spear splintered and accidentally went through his helmet and killed him. So it was not at all like what's described in the quatrain.
Some say Nostradamus foresaw one of the most famous events in Europe's history, London's Great Fire of 1666.
The blood of the just will be demanded at London, burnt by lightning fire in 23 the sixes. The ancient lady will fall from her high place, and many of the same sect will be killed.
But these lines, written by Nostradamus in 1564, could also describe disturbing events taking place in his own lifetime.
Another famous alleged prophecy by Nostradamus was the Great Fire of London, but in actuality it was probably another social commentary by Nostradamus, this on the burning of the innocents in London, having nothing to do with a fire 100 years later, but in his own time the burning of women as witches. And the thunderbolts and the references to the flames and things that were burning is in reference to the lit sticks that get the bonfire going, to which you put the witch, the woman on, and she's burned to death. So he was horrified by this. And that was what the commentary was about.
Naysayers also offer an alternative explanation for the scientific breakthroughs foretold of in the quatrains. They believe Nostradamus was merely recounting the fanciful visions his contemporaries often reported seeing in the clouds.
The prophecies that are alleged to apply to submarines or aircraft or even space travel are, for the most part, complete misunderstandings of Nostradamus's reworkings of known events. In this case, visions that people were reported as seeing in the clouds. That's the aeroplanes. And not only do we have accounts of these, but we actually have illustrations, woodcuts of these monsters and these visions in the clouds. So they're not aeroplanes, they're not submarines.
The figure of Napoleon Bonaparte is said to be at the center of several quatrains.
An emperor will be born near Italy. He will cost his empire very dearly. He will be found less a prince than a butcher. From a simple soldier, he will attain the empire. From a short robe, he will attain the long.
But while the verse seems to describe Napoleon, in truth, it could be about anyone.
The quatrain that allegedly has to do with Napoleon talks about from a simple soldier he will attain a great empire. Of course, this could apply to almost anybody. I mean, Harry Truman, for gosh sakes, who was a simple soldier in the First World War. By the end of the Second World War, he was president of the United States and dropped the atomic bomb. This could apply to anybody.
For Nostradamians, the clearest and most chilling of the quatrains seem to describe Adolf Hitler.
Beasts wild with hunger will cross rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister.
Hitler is nowhere predicted in Nostradamus. True, on one occasion he talks about a captain of great Germany, which I suppose would vaguely fit. But the normal assertion is that because he uses the word Hister, H-I-S-T-E-R, on a number of occasions, this is actually a slight reworking of the name Hitler.
Why wouldn't he just write Hitler? Why not just write that word? That could be important, you know?
And if, as many believe, Nostradamus' prophecies addressed the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, they offered nothing in the way of warning.
Anyone who believes in Nostradamus and thinks 9/11 was in those books needs to be brought up to trial. Where were they on 9/10? I don't care about 9/11, because remember, it was airplanes, which means if you knew on 9/10, you could stop it. If I had a book in my possession that had anything at all about what was going to happen on 9/11, and I did not give that information over to people who could stop it, I don't think you have a more direct textbook definition of evil.
Despite the rational arguments criticizing his most outrageous prophecies, Nostradamus continues to be seen as a prophet by many.
The world is interested in Nostradamus every time there is a serious world crisis, because we open the text of the prophecies to find an answer to the crisis.
And if the printed word has been his vehicle for the last 500 years, The events of 9/11 propelled Nostradamus into a medium even he may have never predicted.
One of the real manifestations of Nostradamus of recent years has been the hoo-ha following 9/11. There were over 8,000 inquiries as to whether Nostradamus had predicted it, directed to the main Nostradamus news group on the internet. At the same time, the main Nostradamus sites were being absolutely inundated with inquiries. One of them had over 500,000 inquiries and had to close down.
In the days after September 11th, Nostradamus was all over the internet. It was one of the top searches in Google. The #1 best-selling book on Amazon.com was a biography of Nostradamus, as well as 5 other books that were in the top 25 best-selling books in Amazon.com. So he was everywhere.
This chilling prophecy, allegedly penned by Nostradamus, was splashed across internet screens 2 days after the tragic attacks.
In the city of God, there will be a great thunder. 2 brothers torn apart by chaos. While the fortress endures, the great leader will succumb. The 3rd big war will begin when the big city is burning.
But Nostradamus died in 1566. He could not have written this passage in 1654, and the quatrain was not to be found in his published work. It was a hoax. Still, while skeptical inquiries put his so-called predictions in doubt, Nostradamus continues to be a household name and a best-selling author. The question that remains is, why?
Nostradamus is still popular for a couple of reasons. One, we have this sage from the Middle Ages, and we have this notion that there's a certain kind of deep ancient wisdom that we can inherit. Part of it is, I think, just media-driven. It's like an urban legend, a story that just gets repeated over and over and over.
But if Nostradamus' story is simply an urban legend, it has stood the test of time. Nowhere is this more apparent than in his hometown of Salon de Provence. 500 years after his death, the spirit of Nostradamus continues to instill fear and trepidation in even the bravest of souls. You are watching Nostradamus, 500 years later, on the History Channel. Salon de Provence, the sunny walled city in the south of France, is still the perfect place for the Nostradamus legend to flourish. It was here that he wrote some 36,000 words of prophecy and prediction, raised 6 children, and began a publishing legacy that has lasted longer than anyone, save Nostradamus himself, could have ever predicted. By the time he was 62, his almanacs and collections of 4-line quatrains were being printed throughout Europe and read in German, Italian, English, Spanish, and their original, French. During the last year and a half of his life, he penned the majority of his prophecies. In 1565, his 10th and final collection of quatrains was completed. But as he approached his 63rd birthday, his health began to decline.
Arthritis and gout and dropsy, edema. The gout had been increasing for some time. It was quite a common complaint at the time.
Records indicate that Nostradamus began writing his will in 1566. His vast collection of treasures and coins amassed during his wanderings across Europe was worth the equivalent of nearly $1 million today. Although the prophet had made much of his living selling the future to his clients, he could not be sure which of his own sons would survive to inherit his most important possessions. And so his collection of books and letters was bequeathed to whichever of his 3 sons survived to reach adulthood first. His son Caesar was named to inherit the brass astrolabe that Nostradamus received from his grandfather. In June of 1566, he asked that his bed be moved upstairs into his secret study, where he awaited his end. He dictated his last prediction to his secretary and scribe, Jean Chavigny, on July 1st, 1566.
That he really knew the time of his death to the day, even to the hour, I can attest as fact. He said, you will not see me alive at sunrise.
Chauvenet reports that he told him that he wouldn't see him alive by the next morning. And that was true. They found him standing dead at his workplace the next morning.
Nostradamus' wife, Anne Ponsard, carried out his final wishes. He was entombed in a Franciscan church in Salon, where he remained undisturbed for 200 years. But in 1789, during the chaos of the French Revolution, his tomb was opened and desecrated by looters. The event spawned a legend that the perpetrators had found Nostradamus' skeletal remains and a medallion around his bony neck. It was said to be inscribed with the Roman numerals for the exact year that the tomb would be opened and plundered. That same year, Nostradamus' remains were collected and moved to their final resting place in the Church of Saint-Laurent in Salon de Provence.
Now, originally, Nostradamus was buried standing up, the way he was found the morning after he died. After his original tomb was looted, a few bones were returned, and this is what's buried here.
His crypt occupies a place of honor in the aptly named Notre Dame Chapel.
This is the second burial place of Nostradamus. The inscription reads, "The blessed bones of Michel Nostradamus, who in the opinion of all mortals, with his almost divine pen, predicted the calamitous future events by means of the stars."
Although it has been nearly 5 centuries since Nostradamus walked these cobblestone streets, it is impossible to visit Salon de Provence today without bumping into him. The house where he wrote his famous prophecies in seclusion is now a museum. A wax effigy of the seer works tirelessly in a secret study near the entrance.
Each year at the museum, we have visitors from 60 to 70 foreign countries that come to discover Nostradamus or to work with his writings and history.
Indeed, on his 500th birthday, Nostradamus' legend is still very much alive. The grand Château de l'Emperie, once the place where he met with the Queen of France, now beckons visitors who come to walk in the prophet's footsteps and buy a Nostradamus t-shirt, book, or souvenir doll. But skeptic or believer, there is no doubt people are drawn by his memory and his mystery.
Each person interested in the writings of Nostradamus has the right to make his own interpretation, and we are not there to say, think this or think that. We have much factual knowledge about his life mixed with areas of shadows and uncertainties. We are here to tell the public, okay, this is fact, but other things we don't know.
It has been said that Nostradamus' darkest writings are warnings of Armageddon.
Tears, cries and laments, howls, terror, inhuman heart, cruel, black, and making one shudder with fear. Blood to be shed, hunger for bread and cheese, to none mercy.
But experts believe these are warnings, not promises, and that the most important concept Nostradamus left behind is that the future is not set in stone.
All the wordplay, all the green language, puns, and so forth were meant to set the situation up so that the person reading the prophecies would only understand them as the event happened. In other words, Nostradamus wasn't trying to predict the future. He was trying to give us a roadmap to alternative futures.
The last date mentioned in Nostradamus' prophecies is 3797, but he doesn't say anything is going to happen then, merely that that's when his prophecies run out. You might think that's the end of the world.
In reality, Nostradamus tells us that he made cyclical calculations after the ancient Babylonian method, and that using the cyclical calculation, he was able to see as far as 3797 AD, which leaves us enough additional time to better study Nostradamus.
Those who cannot wait until the year 3797 to find out must judge for themselves whether the prophecies of Nostradamus have proved true in the past and whether they may still anticipate events that are yet to come. But of one bold prediction we can be sure. In the preface of his final verses of prophecies dated 1557, Nostradamus solemnly predicted,
"As time elapses after my death, my writings will have more weight than during my lifetime."
No one can deny that here, Nostradamus was right.